My grandfather was a kind, generous man. He was the type of grandfather who would slip you a sweet or a cookie after your parents had already said no, with a quick wink and a finger to his lip. The kind of old man who'd roll up his sleeves and get stuck in helping your dad fix the car or put some shelves up, even well into his 80s. He had a slight stoop, a shock of white hair, and a deep, throaty laugh. Those are the things that I remember most clearly about him. That and his penchant for dressing sharp. You never saw him without a shirt and a tie, or a sports jacket, a suit. He wore suspenders rather than a belt to hold up his pants. Just occasionally, he'd freeze up. I don't really remember when I first noticed it, but it was really bizarre. One minute he'd be chatting away, happy to my mom and grandma, a mug of hot tea in his hand, and the next, he'd just stop, frozen in time, as his eyes glazed over. Even more weirdly, the conversation would continue to flow around him, as if nothing had happened. A few minutes later, maybe up to a half hour, he'd unfreeze and rejoin the conversation, his tea now cold and forgotten. He drank a lot of cold cups of tea. I asked my mother about this once, and she told me that sometimes Granddaddy froze up because of what he'd seen in the Army, and that it was a medical condition called shell shock. I didn't really understand what that meant at the time, but it seemed a suitable answer to my young, inquisitive mind, and I didn't ask any further. Like many of his generation, he'd been to war. He didn't talk about it much, but I remember once seeing his medals in a drawer, tarnished and gathering dust, and I wondered why he didn't take better care of them. I found out later that, like many young men, he'd volunteered in the summer of 1914, and he'd been sent out to France as part of the new service battalions, just in time for the great reaping of souls known as the Battle of the Somme. I snuck in once, years later, and pulled out the medals so that I could take a good look at them. There were 3. A bronze star with 2 swords across it, a silver one, and a gold one. There was also a dull bronze strip, about 2 inches long, but very thin. I wondered what the medals were for, and this was the days before Google. I had to go down to the library to look them up. The librarian recommended a stuffy old tome with dull black and white pictures, but it depicted quite clearly the medals I'd seen in my grandfather's drawer. According to the book, they were the British War Medal, the British Victory Medal, and the 1914 Star. They were the standard campaign medals awarded to most British servicemen serving around 1914. I found myself slightly disappointed that they were not issued for some heroic deed, but I still wondered why he'd shoved them in a drawer and forgotten about them. And then I remembered the bronze strip and flicked through the book in the hopes of finding an illustration. Sure enough, there was a picture of a similar strip. According to the book, this was a wound stripe, awarded to soldiers who'd suffered an injury in battle. Suddenly, it all made a lot more sense, and I realized why he didn't like to talk about it with us. It also made more sense why he'd occasionally freeze up. I assumed it must just be to do with the wound. My curiosity satisfied, I left the matter and soon forgot all about it. That Christmas, because I was 16, my dad let me have a few drinks with Christmas dinner, and afterwards the men sat round the table with a glass of whiskey and a cigar, and we told jokes and talked about world affairs and just generally enjoyed ourselves. This was the first time I'd been invited to stay, and it felt like a real privilege, being treated like one of the men. My mother, my grandmother, and my aunts left to chat in the kitchen and wash up, while my sister and cousins went into the lounge to play with their new toys. We chatted and joked and swore and laughed, had a great time just being guys. No wives or kids within earshot. I really felt I was part of something. Uncle Bob had just finished telling a risque joke about a barmaid when Granddad spoke up, and he said, "When I was in the war." We all turned to him, and our laughter subsided, and we prepared to listen to what he had to say. I learned later that after a few drinks, he'd occasionally start reminiscing about his war days, but never when Grandma or any of the kids were around. They were usually about some of the pranks they'd pulled on the sergeant or a drunken night on leave. This story was not like those. One night, the sergeant told us we were going on a night raid. Usual business, up over the parapet after dusk. Quick race of the enemy lines, maybe snatch a sentry for interrogation and unit identification. The brass always wanted to know who we were facing, and if it was a new unit or a reserve one, it might be worth planning an attack. I got tooled up with the rest of the lads, rifles, bayonets, some ammo in my pocket. None of our usual marching kit, as it might get snagged on a wire or make a sound and give us away. I was the number 1 on the Lewis gun, a big, heavy gun far too unwieldy to take on a raid. So I just carried my Webley revolver and a trench club I'd made by hammering hobnails into an axe handle. The thought of this made me slightly queasy. I'd seen photos of trench clubs in the library book, evil-looking blunt instruments with vicious spikes. It's difficult to contemplate how someone as kind and gentle as my grandfather could have made one of those for the express purpose of breaking bones and caving in skulls. We went forward through the churned earth, past the corpses of Germans' last attack. I remember my mate Harry slipped on some poor guy's entrails and swore under his breath. The sergeant gave him a dark look for making the noise, and we all smiled, thinking about the hell he'd get when we got back to our lines. We were all shitting ourselves with fear. You always did when you went out on a raid, so anything seemed funny at that point. When you see your mates die every day, when a shell or a bullet or a bomb could kill you at any moment, you learn to live with fear. You get used to it. But stepping out onto no man's land, that's another fear altogether. You feel naked, alone in the universe, and it feels like every sniper in the German army is drawing a bead on you, ready to blow your head off. It's enough to drive a man mad. All talk had ceased round the table at this point. Everyone was listening in, enraptured by my grandfather's speaking. He was staring into the middle distance as he spoke. He'd frozen up earlier in the day, when my sister had squealed over a new gift she had received. His face was the same now, except for his mouth moving as he spoke. This time, it was even worse. We all felt it. A cold fog had rolled in over no man's land, which any other time would seem like a blessing as it masked our movements from the Germans. But that night, it seemed ominous, malevolent. We kept moving forward. We couldn't see the enemy lines through the fog, but we knew they were close, so we kept low and slow. As we moved up, I began to see a shape emerge from the fog. The sergeant saw it too, waved us down into a holding pattern. We all drew a bead on the shape. After a few moments, we got the nod and began to move up. As we got closer, we began to make out the shape of a man. He didn't seem to be doing anything, just standing, alone, staring at us. I'm not prone to superstition, but it was so creepy. I looked at the Sarge and he nodded to me. And I thought, shit, I've got to investigate. I stepped closer and began to make out a little more. It was a German uniform with one of the old spiked helmets still on its head. I began to make out the features on his face, and I could swear that he was smiling at me. I took another step and felt something shift under my feet, and I nearly pissed myself. I didn't dare look down to see what it was. I didn't want to take my eyes off of what was in front of me. Another step closer, gripping my weapons with white knuckles. I suddenly noticed it. I nearly laughed out loud as the tension drifted away. He was hanging up on barbed wire, caught up in the entanglements and dead as a doorknob. I heard the tales of this from some of the old sweats, men getting so entangled when they died that the wire kept them standing up. I felt so relieved. I carried on towards him in my giddy state. I figured that the helmet would make a good souvenir. When I grabbed the spike, the head fell back. He trailed away, and for a moment we thought he was having one of his moments. But then he looked directly at me, focusing for the first time, and I felt dread clawing up my spine. He didn't have any eyes, just two gaping holes as if they'd been ripped out by something or someone. I felt the courage of a moment before drain out of me, and I dropped the helmet, and it clattered on the ground. I'd seen a lot of bodies by this point, some of them close friends, but something about this one seemed different. Wrong. The feeling of being watched crept over me again, and I wondered if this was some new and evil trap the bastards had set up for us. I wanted to crawl up into a ball and hide, but I couldn't let my mates down. I turned around to see where they were, but the fog was thicker now and I couldn't see them anymore. I had to find them, let the sergeant know what I'd seen. So I began making my way back towards them. I looked back occasionally, a sixth sense not wanting me to look away from the corpse behind me. At this point, my granddad was staring back into the middle distance again, and I glanced at my father, but the look on his face told me this was a tale he hadn't heard before, and the color had drained from his face. I'd moved about 20 yards when I realized I should have come across them by now. I looked back, but the corpse had disappeared back into the fog and I was alone. I assumed that the sergeant had decided to call off the raid as the fog had gotten worse and that they'd left me behind. Anger at being abandoned overcame my fear, and I strode forward. I saw a shape ahead of me. I assumed it was the rear guard of the unit, so I redoubled my pace, hoping to catch up to him. As I moved closer, I realized he wasn't moving and he was hung up on the wire. And with a sigh of frustration, I assumed I'd been turned around in the fog and somehow made my way back to the corpse. So this time I resolved to go and grab that helmet so I'd at least have something to show for this whole mess. But as I approached, I began to feel that same sense of deep unease that I had before. And as I got closer, I realized why I was feeling so uncomfortable. It was a different man. Same pose, same sightless grin, but this man wasn't the German I'd seen before. He was wearing a British uniform. I vomited, not because he was dead, but because the blood seeping from the eye sockets was fresh, but because it wasn't just anybody. It was my friend Harry. I felt sick. Harry had been on patrol with me. How could he now be strung up on wire like this? I tried to pull the fat, rusty strands of wire off him, but all I succeeded in doing was tearing my hands. My club and revolver were useless, and I wished I had some wire cutters or even a knife. I fell at his feet and I wept. I had no idea where our lines were in the fog, and I was helpless to do anything for my friend. And as I lay there, tears streaming down my face, I heard a shrill scream that chilled me to the bone. I was frozen in place, terror overtaking all other feelings. I could have been there for hours or minutes. I couldn't tell. Then I heard that scream again, and this time it triggered something in my brain, and I got up and I ran. I didn't care anymore. I'd prefer a German bullet in my brain than let whatever was out there catch me. It felt like I ran for hours, stumbling over the shell holes and the dirt of no man's land. Eventually I heard an English voice call out, and I called back that I was a friend, and stumbled into the front line trench. I was battered and bloodied and worn from the wire, but I never felt so safe in a front line trench in all of my life. I was the only man from my unit to ever return. Granddad paused for a moment, long enough that we all looked at each other, wondering if the story was over. It had grown overcast outside, and it felt cold in the dining room, despite the fire crackling in the grate. The pause lasted so long. I was desperate for someone to break the silence, and just as it looked like Uncle Bob would break it, Granddad spoke again. 2 weeks later, we mounted an attack on the same sector. I took a round in my shoulder in the confusion, and I lay in a shell hole for a day before the stretcher bearers found me. I'd lost a lot of blood and was swimming in and out of consciousness. When I came to, I had a hole in my shoulder. A little bit of brass to say I'd been wounded in combat. And I had this. He pointed to a faded white scar above his left eye. Something had tried to gouge out my eye.